G'day, Starlo here, and welcome to the fourth instalment of these Tuesday chats, brought to you by CM Partners Accountants, who I'll tell you a little bit more about later on. In the first 3 episodes of this series, I looked back over my earliest fishing memories and talked about the things that shaped my life and my career as a fishing communicator and educator. Last episode, I took a deep dive into the years that I spent on the Rex Hunt Fishing Adventures show, travelling the country and the world with Rex, Bushy and the crew. Some fantastic memories there. If you missed that episode, make sure you go back and have a look or a listen to it. I finished that third Tuesday chat with the Rex Hunt show finally winding up and Bushy and myself looking around for our next gig. We even did a TV show of our own for a while called Hooked on Adventure, which was originally only shown in Western Australia, but later got national distribution through some of the Channel 7 affiliates. You might have seen a couple of episodes. We had heaps of fun doing it, but it barely covered its own production costs. We just didn't have the draw card of a big Rexy, so it was always going to be a niche lifestyle program. On the fishing front at that time, Bushy and I had gone absolutely nuts on our brim on lures fishing. Thanks to the new wave of sophisticated gear that was coming from companies like Shimano, we found ourselves able to cast really small, lightweight, hard-bodied minnows. Things like the Australian-made Attack, the little Halcos, and some of the old standards like the Rebel Crawdad. And we started catching a lot of brim on lures. In fact, the whole thing was a bit of a revelation. Look, a lot of people, including us, have been catching the odd brim on lures for decades, but suddenly we took it to the next level and we started catching really serious numbers of brim. In fact, at one stage, Bushy called me and he said, I reckon between us we can crack the magic ton in a day, 100 brim on lures. So anyway, I travelled down to his neck of the woods on the far south coast of New South Wales and we had a session that I'll never forget. We actually counted every fish we caught and we ended up catching 157 fish on those little hard-bodied minnows. Mostly brim, but also estuary perch, flathead, tailor, even weird and wonderful things like little silver biddies. Yeah, we counted everything, no matter how big it was. But there was a fair sprinkling of good brim in that catch as well, including fish over the 40-centimetre mark. What a day. Funnily enough, it's almost impossible to catch numbers like that these days. I think we've just educated them too much. Too many anglers out there showing them too many lures. They really were the good old days in some ways. But as good as all that action was that we were experiencing on the little hard bodies, both of us thought that there was still another step we could take in the whole brim on lures scene, and we figured it would lie with the soft plastics that we were playing around with at the time. Look, as I've explained many times before, soft plastics have been around since the 1940s or 50s when they came out of the US. They were a little slower to take off in Australia, and really, people only dabbled in them right up until the 90s. But by the late 90s, Bushy and I were starting to find out some really interesting stuff about fishing small finesse soft plastics on species like brim. There was a product around at the time called the bucket of bait. Anyway, you'd buy this little plastic bucket with a lid and it was crammed full of weird and wonderful soft plastics from the US. And buried in the bottom there somewhere would be a couple of little curly tail grubs, usually pink or red. Well, Bushy and I'd buy the whole bucket of bait just to get those couple of little grubs because we found they were absolutely deadly on the brim. In fact, bit of a funny story, around that time we got invited to appear on an episode of E.T.'s show on TV. Bushy and I were to take him brim fishing down on the far south coast of New South Wales with lures. And we'd both been starting to catch ridiculous amounts of brim on those little grubs. So we had a bit of a discussion beforehand and we said, look, we won't actually use those. We don't know enough about it yet and we don't want to let the cat out of the bag. So we'll just stick with the hard bodies because we know we'll catch enough brim on those. And we had a great session with E.T. catching brim on hard bodies. He was really good at it too. But then the fishing started to slow down. So I didn't say anything, but I snuck up to the tackle box and swapped my little hard body out for one of those little grubs we've been getting out of the bucket of bait, and straight away I started banging the fish. Bushy hadn't seen me make the changeover and he's giving me the old side eye, and eventually he came over and had a look and he just shook his head. And of course E.T. wanted to know all about them, and the cat was very much out of the bag. But they were still really hard to get. We were either buying those buckets of bait and digging through them looking for them, or we were ordering them online. I was getting XPS brand curly tails out of Bass Pro Shops in the US at the time that fished really well on a lot of our local species, including the brim. But it was a convoluted exercise. You had to order them in from overseas and wait for them to arrive, and they weren't all that cheap with the exchange rate and the freight and everything else. It was really hard to get the right jig heads too for presenting those little plastics, and Bushy and I were making our own. We made hundreds. We used to get mustard Aberdeen hooks and painstakingly bend the shanks to get the eye up orientation, breaking a fair few in the process. And then we'd crimp split shot onto the bend that we'd made, and quite often hand colour it, often with nail polish. Now there's a funny story. I was down at Bushy's one time, and we're walking down the main street of his little town, and he's grabbed me and dragged me into the chemist, and he's gone straight up to the nail polish rack, and he's picking up the bottles, and he's going to me, "This is my favourite one, you should get some of this." Should have seen the look on the face of the girl behind the counter. Rather serendipitously, at this same time, Steve Morgan's ABT tournament juggernaut took the big move from just being about bass fishing to including brim. And so Bushy and I dived into the tournament scene. We won a couple of tournaments. I was actually captain of the New South Wales team in 2001 when it won the national championships, I guess. It was really a state of origin between New South Wales and Queensland in those days. We were still using the little hard bodies a lot, but we were also starting to play around with the plastics. And over the next season or two, soft plastics revolutionised that brim tournament scene. One of our favourites at the time was the little Berkeley bass minnow in the watermelon green colour. That, fished on a light head, was deadly on the brim. It had a glitter on it, and I can remember Bushy coming into some of the brim weigh-ins with his face and his trademark moustache all covered in the glitter from handling the Berkeley bass minnows all day. He looked like he'd had a big night at the disco or the nightclub. And remarkably, another sliding doors moment happened at this time. Bushy and I were both members of the Shimano Australia Pro Angler team, and we did quite a bit of work for Shimano. And the then boss of Shimano in Australia, the late, great John Dunphy, came to us one day and said, "Look, we've just got access via Rapala," and Shimano Australia were actually the Australian Rapala agents at that time as well. "We've just got access to the biggest soft plastic lure manufacturing factory in the world in southern China. Would you two be interested in designing some soft plastics specifically for the Australian market?" Well, Bushy and I looked at each other and we just about knocked Dumph over in our eagerness to accept his offer. Maybe we would have paused for a few seconds if we'd known quite how much work was going to be involved in it, but I doubt it. That marked the beginning of about an 18-month period of design and development. Bushy used to hand carve a lot of the little shapes for the plastics out of balsa and other materials, and I'd do detailed drawings and go out and take photos of bait fish and prawns and all sorts of other fish tucker, and we sent all this off to the factory in China, and eventually some prototypes started coming back. And the first ones were pretty horrendous. They didn't have the actions we were looking for. They had weird goldfish heads and pouting lips and bulging eyes. They looked like something you'd see on the wallpaper at the local Chinese restaurant. They didn't quite get it. But we told them that, and we kept refining things, and eventually the prototypes started getting better and better, and we started catching a lot of fish on them. We had a fair idea we were on a winner. So we needed to come up with a name for these new lures, and Bushy and I had been referring to the soft plastics we were using by all sorts of nicknames, things like gummy bears and squishies and squidgies. So we said to the Shimano guys, "Let's call them Squidgies." Well, I could see that they were a bit unimpressed, but they let us have our heads and run with it, and the rest, as they say, is history. It worked. We also had a bit of fun with the model names and the colours, things like Drop Bear and Killer Tomato and Evil Minnow that became absolutely famous, and maybe infamous in the case of Gary Glitter. Maybe the less said about that, the better. So by the early 2000s, we were ready to go out onto the tackle shop shelves with our new products. And we kicked off with just 3 different designs of soft plastic tails: the Wriggler, the Fish, and the shad. And each one only came in a couple of sizes and about half a dozen colours. And a little bit later, we came out with jig heads to go with them. But Bushy and I both knew that it wasn't enough just to have a great product out there. Because it was fairly new to a lot of Australian fishermen, we needed to teach them how best to use soft plastics. So we started what turned into virtually a national tour, travelling around doing what we came to call Squidgy nights, presentations to crowds that varied from a dozen or so anglers at the local fishing club to literally hundreds, and on a couple of occasions even 1,000 and more in an audience. I'll never forget the first one we did in Tasmania. Bushy and I flew into Hobart and our plane was really late. We got picked up by the local Shimano agent, Paul Ellis, and he was stressing out big time because we were running late to get to the venue, one of the big hotels down on the waterfront. We had no idea what kind of crowd we were going to draw for this Squidgy night. Anyway, we arrived at the back of the hotel, went in through the back entrance and came out onto the stage. Bushy and I came out through this door. There was bright floodlights and a crowd out there. And seriously, I thought we'd walked into the wrong auditorium and that there was going to be a rock concert or something in there, because there were hundreds, maybe 1,000 people in the audience, and they all burst into cheering and applause when we came out on stage. And Bushy and I looked at each other and went, this must be it. And it was the Squidgy night. Fantastic. A little bit daunting, but anyway, people seem to love it. As well as the tour and the Squidgy nights, we produced a series of Squidgy Secrets videos, first of all on VHS cassettes and then later on DVDs, and these were immensely popular as well. I'm quite proud to say that between us, we changed the way Australians go fishing, and we gave a lot of enjoyment to a lot of people. I still meet people every week who either started their fishing career at that time or made the change from bait to lures and have never looked back and have enjoyed a fantastic lifetime of fishing thanks to the Squidgy phenomenon. I dread to think how many fish have been caught on Squidgies over the subsequent years. I guess it could even be argued that in some scenarios they were too effective. I know that Victorian fisheries changed the rules for dusky flathead in Victoria based largely on the incredible catches that were being made at places like Malakuta by the late noughties and early 2010s. And for this reason, we were always strongly pushing the conservation message through our videos, and even the labelling on the Squidgies themselves. We always talked about fishing sustainably, not killing your limit but limiting your kill, and putting some fish back for the future. And happily, a lot of people have followed that ethos. The next decade was a bit of a blur. Squidgies really owned the soft plastic market in Australia for at least 5 or 6 years, and we sold an incredible amount of them. We came out with a lot more models and sizes and colours and all sorts of accessories to go with them. Bushy and I were constantly working on new additions to the range. A lot of people think that Bushy and myself owned the Squidgy brand, and that was never the case. It always belonged to Shimano, either through John Dunphy Fishing Imports to begin with, and then later through Shimano Australia itself. We were only ever employed to design and promote the lures, in return for which we got a single-digit commission split between us. It turned into quite a good gig though, because there was a lot of Squidgies sold during that era. It was certainly the most significant part of my income through that period and really supported me and my family. The original agreement with John Dunphy had been a verbal one, sealed with a handshake, which is the way John did business, and he was a straight shooter and as honest as they come. Eventually, of course, we had to turn it into annual contracts that we'd sign, but we always knew there'd be a sunset period and an eventual end to the agreement, and that finally came in September 2016. And following that date, Bushy and I received no royalties or payments from the sale of Squidgies and had no direct input into their design. I've remained a Squidgy pro angler and a proud part of their team, and I do quite a bit of the social media work for Squidgies and Shimano, for which I'm paid a modest quarterly retainer. To be honest, by the time our gig with Squidgies came to an end, the whole Squidgy phenomenon had peaked, plateaued, and was beginning to decline because, as I said, there was a lot of competition out there. There are lots and lots of soft plastics on the market these days. Squidgies are still there too, and they remain my favourite soft plastic and the one that I use most of the time, although I do dabble with some of the other brands as well, just to see what's going on in the soft plastic world. The Squidgies are designed in-house by Shimano these days, and they keep coming out with some really nice models, like the prawns of recent times, and one of their latest, the ridge shad, which I really like. But I guess none of them will ever become classics in the way that the old bloodworm wriggler did, and it's still around. The interesting thing about the bloodworm wriggler, we like to refer to it as 50 Shades of Bloodworm, because the colour did change quite a bit over the years that it's been on sale. There are all sorts of different hues of bloodworm, and people are always saying, oh, you need to bring back the original one, it was heaps better. But the funny thing is, you get 6 of those people and put them in a room with a selection of all the different colours that have been in the bloodworm range over the years, and it's hard to get 2 of them to agree on which one was the original. Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. I've fished with them all, and I've caught fish on them all. I really think it makes a bit more difference to the angler than it does to the fish. But anyway, soft plastics are just such an integral part of the Australian fishing scene these days, and a lot of the younger generation probably don't realise that that was not the case as recently as the late 1990s. Soft plastics have boomed since then, and I can't see them going away. And Squidgies played a huge role in that here in Australia. It's a legacy that I'm proud to have been a part of. I continue to enjoy educating people on how to best use their soft plastics too. In fact, I've just built my first online course on soft plastic fishing, and it's being tested by a team of beta testers at the moment who are really enjoying it. It'll go public in a month or two's time. If you want to get on the list to find out when that happens, I'll put a link down below in the description so that you can do that and you can pre-order the course when it finally drops. It's a beauty. Which brings us up to the modern era in recreational fishing communication, which has seen massive changes, including the decline of print media, the virtual disappearance of fishing magazines, and no one seems to read books much anymore, the rise of social media, the amazing impact of YouTube on fishing, and those are all things that I'm going to talk about in next Tuesday's chat, which once again will be brought to you by CM Partners Accounting. Now look, if you own or run a business and you've got an accountant who you just find difficult to get hold of, or who doesn't seem to speak the same language as you really need to try CM Partners. I've found them absolutely fantastic. They'll give you a free consultation, completely free of obligation, if you use the Starlo link in the description down below, and make sure you tell them that Starlo sent you. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up down below and subscribe to the channel if you don't already. And don't forget that this is building into a whole playlist of these Tuesday chats, and I'll keep them going for as long as you're interested in watching them. I'm enjoying doing them, and a lot of you seem to be enjoying watching or listening to them, because yes, it's available as a podcast as well. All right, I'll catch you next Tuesday, and until then, this is Starlo wishing you tight lines and happy squidgying. Squidgying? Is that even a word? That is now.